I read Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading all of the Cosmere books in their published order, and then talking about the connections and symbolic philosophy contained in each book. So you're going to get spoilers for Elantris, the first Mistborn trilogy, part of the second era of Mistborn, Warbreaker, the short stories that have come out so far, and even maybe the first volume of White Sand, the graphic novel. And so I feel like Oathbreaker is kind of a big pivot point, especially for the Stormlight Archive, but maybe for the entire Cosmere, because what we start to see in this book is a departure from typical epic fantasy tropes and maybe fantasy in general. There's already been lots of hints of this in the Cosmere up to this point. I mean, you just take the first era of Mistborn and it already turns these epic fantasy tropes on their head, but it's doing it in a real adventure fantasy genre bending kind of way that I think doesn't feel as emotionally surprising as a reader as Oathbringer does. And so what I mean by that is that, you know, in the first two books of the Stormlight Archive, we have this epic fantasy setting and register, all of these characters, these very highly detailed cultures, all of this world building in the setting, and the very, very long length all speaks to a tradition that, you know, in the genre of epic fantasy is building towards this apocalyptic confrontation between good and evil, where you have the humans who have access to this righteous ancient magic that was misunderstood versus the kind of evil race of monsters who have evil magic. And there's going to be this big confrontation between the two of them, this epic war that's going to change history forever. And you see this in epic fantasy again and again and again. You know, races like orcs and kobolds and, you know, horrors from the deep and all of this kind of stuff in other epic fantasy. And Sanderson has built us up to believe that we're going to have the Parshendi or the listeners, whatever you want to call them, that the humans have been confronting for the last two books. And we've had this promise that the Parshendi, that is where that's coming from for me, the Parshendi are going to be the Voidbringers, and that we have this storm that comes out at the end of the second Stormlight book that changes all of the Parshendi into the Voidbringers, and that these monsters are going to turn against their slave masters. They're going to overturn all of society in one kind of coordinated fell swoop maneuver, and that the humans are massively underprepared for this entire event in multiple different ways. You know, their entire cities are built to withstand storms from a different direction. So the Everstorm is going to come in and wreak havoc in a natural disaster kind of way. But then it's also going to overturn their society by taking away their free labor force. And additionally, having all of that free labor force in position to just kind of cut the throats of their masters instantly and overturn 3,000 years of civilization in a moment. And so that's kind of the promise that it feels like the book is making at the end of the second novel. And when we step into the beginning of this novel, everything is not what we thought it was, because Sanderson is taking this idea of the epic fantasy promise of, you know, the good race versus the evil race, and just totally messing with it. Everything is just going to pivot around 180 degrees. And because the project of the Cosmere is more about building communities, it's about radical inclusion, It's about examining what it means to be a person, what it means to be alive in the world, and those divisions between good and evil that don't simply boil down to, well, what kind of race are you, right? Like, that is a really problematic theme to be building an entire universe on. Instead, Sanderson is doing something way more interesting and crunchy, more philosophical, and we've been examining that all the way up until this point. And to play into that trope of epic fantasy would be a betrayal of everything that he's built up to this point, I think. And so what Oathbringer really does is deliver on the promise that has been building since Elantris, I think. But as a reader coming into Oathbringer for the first time, I think it's very, very surprising and maybe even a little bit confusing if you're a fan of epic fantasy and you're expecting to get delivered that story. Additionally, what I think is so impressive about this massive, massive, very long book is that this entire situation of the Everstorm plays beautifully into Dalinar's story, who is the main character this time in our novel, where, Kaladin was the main character of the first one, Shallan was the main character of the second one, and now Dalinar is the one who we're getting the backstory flashback chapters of in this book. And I've talked about, from the very beginning of the Stormlight Archive, the way that this massive amount of time has been an important feature in the story, and how time itself plays into the very structure of these novels. And what we're looking at here is that, not only are we having these flashbacks with Dalinar, but the way that we experience the flashbacks, this kind of marries structurally the interesting thing that he has been doing with both Kaladin and Shallan. So I just kind of interrupted myself there, and I interrupted myself to say that I interrupted myself. But bear with me. Here's what I'm saying, is that we introduce in the first book the structure of the flashbacks, that we are going to move backwards in time occasionally to uncover the backstory of the character. You'll be like, okay, so structurally, this is what I should expect from the second book, right? Then we get more of the flashbacks with Shallan uncovering her backstory. But simultaneously, we have this problem with Shallan where she's hiding things about herself from herself. And so the flashbacks operate almost as a real-time uncovering to Shallan of herself. These elements that she uncovers become undeniable facts that are reintegrated back into her psyche, and she can no longer run away from them. So now with Dalinar, we're going to combine these two elements of the structure. We're going to have an uncovering of Dalinar's backstory, but it's going to be, just like Shallan, a revealing of these events to Dalinar. Except in this case, he's not hiding it from himself. It's an aspect of the magic system in the world. But not only that is happening, the Everstorm itself is an uncovering of the history of Roshar to Roshar. So in other words, the world is going through this same process of finding out its history as Dalinar is personally going through this crucible of learning who he is. So the world itself is kind of mirroring Dalinar's story through the Everstorm as a kind of fictional construct that symbolizes this reintegration of his memories into his personality. I think I've talked about before the science fiction theorist Darko Suvin, who introduced this way of analyzing science fiction that he called cognitive estrangement. And the vehicle in the fiction that delivers this cognitive estrangement is what he called the Novum. So the Novum would be some element of the fiction that is like a plausible kind of idea or object or some kind of conceit within the fiction that, we, the audience, can kind of like understand the idea of it and go like, okay, yeah, I get it. And then that, you like examine the knock-on effects of whatever that is. So like the classic example of this in science fiction is like time travel or like a spaceship, like the Starship Enterprise or something like that, you can understand what it is. And then you're like, oh, okay. And then the Starship Enterprise goes out into the galaxy and encounters new worlds and new civilizations. And then that allows us, the reader, to kind of reflect on our own civilization and think like, why are things the way that they are in my country or on my continent or my period of history instead of being some other way like they are on this planet? And so for Suvin, the Novum, produces this cognitive estrangement where in your mind, you become pulled apart from all of your assumptions about why the world is the way that it is. You don't even question it, right? You're just like, yeah, this is, I live my life, I pay my taxes, I go to work. That's just normal. And then you read a science fiction book and you're like, actually, it's kind of weird that I go to work every day. Why do I do that? And you start to question your world. And this leads to, for Suvin, a kind of political awakening that the science fiction genre, and I think I'm including fantasy into this, can kind of lead to a questioning of your very reality and a kind of political awakening to be like, hey, why is the world the way that it could be better, right? Can't we do a better job? This is kind of weird that we've all just accepted this to be the way that things are. In this story, I think that the Everstorm operates as the Novum. This is the thing that we can understand as readers to be like, okay, there's a magical storm that goes through and it slams into the wrong side of these communities. It uncovers all of the ways that, in a material way, structurally, these communities have been built in a very particular way, and it tears those communities down. And symbolically, it's doing that by taking the slaves who literally built the society and did everything for this society, like underwrote all of their labor, and subtracts them from the society. And not only does that, but it restores their full personalities, which were somehow magically taken from them in exactly the same way that Dalinar's personality was magically subtracted from him. Now, it's not exactly the same. I understand that because Dalinar kind of gave his permission and he went and sought this out. And it seems like what happened to the listeners was forced upon them. And it represents a almost genocidal trauma. But I hope that you can see how structurally these things are clearly linked. Because what the Everstorm is doing is not just overturning the societies on Roshar because of the ways that they have adapted to their existence over the last 3,000 years, it's also overturning that genre structure of epic fantasy that I talked about. When we left book 2 and came to book 3, what we thought was going to happen was that the Parshendi were going to turn into mindless killing evil monsters with lightning superpowers and glowing red eyes, and they were going to start murdering humans for the pure joy of it. And we have reason to believe that this could happen within the Cosmere. Look back to Mistborn Era 1, right? In the third book of Mistborn, you have the Inquisitors and the Kolos rampaging through the world, murdering people wholesale with joy in their hearts, seeing the mountains explode into ash and the crops being destroyed and feeling joy about that. That is the same kind of apocalyptic situation the first time that I came to Oathbringer that, I thought I was going to read. But instead, the Everstorm is changing everything. It's not just changing things within the book, it's changing things about the book. It's changing the structure of epic fantasy within the Cosmere itself. It's changing our expectations. And so as a Novum, it's doing more work than just the regular Novum does of pulling away our experience of the real world and getting us to question why things are the way that they are. We start to question, like, why is this book the way that it is? Why is epic fantasy the way that it is? And like, do I even like this? There's a lot of people who stop at Oathbringer, and I think that this is a big part of the reason why, because the Everstorm and its effects in the story shatter your immersion, shatter your expectations based on, coming to it with a certain genre savviness. You're not looking to find out that one of the main heroes of the story, who we have come to care about and who delivered us that cathartic relief at the end of The Way of Kings by giving away his shard blade to free Kaladin and all the bridgemen, is actually a genocidal murderer of his wife. Like, that's not the story that I would have predicted I was getting when I went into Oathbringer for the first time, right? But that is Dalinar's story. And the thing of it is, even Dalinar doesn't know that going into this book. And so we also experience the uncovering of that with Dalinar. And I think emotionally, it ties us really close to this person who we learn is this heinous perpetrator of war crimes and of a personal murder, even though it's accidental, of his own wife, because his wife was begging him, please stop acting this way. And the fact that he didn't hold himself back from the wrath and malice that he felt directly led to her death. And so I think for Dalinar, the guilt that he feels after what happens to his wife directly leads to his choice to run away from his interiority. In other words, he feels like a murderer, to himself. And so I don't think it's inappropriate that a lot of people read this book and have a very bad feeling about Dalinar and then feel like they can't continue. I feel like it's unfortunate that they don't continue, because it's a really beautiful message that's happening in the story, but I get it, because it's just not what you expect when you pick this book up. I think that feeling directly gets to a kind of philosophical question that Sanderson builds into Dalinar's story, where he talks over and over with Taravangian about this scenario that is built into The Way of Kings, where there are these thieves who stole some hogs or something like that from a farmer. But, there's probably one thief, but there are several suspects. And the question in the story is like, you've rounded up the usual suspects, but you know that some of them are innocent and that some of them are guilty. And the question is like, what do you do about it? Do you execute all of them so that you definitely punish the person who deserves it? Do you let them all go so that you don't punish the people who don't deserve it? Or do you find like some kind of happy medium, well, happy, if you will, where you throw people in jail who don't deserve to be in jail, but at the same time, you're not like executing the wrong person? And then a follow-up question to that has to do with Szeth's story and his mentor, Nail. And we saw in the previous story of Edgedancer how Nail is like deeply psychologically broken. Like he is extremely estranged from his own compassion and empathy and grief. He's doing everything that he can to kind of shut his emotions off and follow the law to do what he feels is honorable and good. But Nail worries very much about recidivism and about like the repeat offenders of like finding criminals and you put them in jail, and then once you let them out again, they just end up being criminals again. Or you punish them in some way where you like cut off a hand for a thief or whatever. And then because you've crippled that person, now they are not fully equipped to do honest work, and they have no other choice but to go back to criminal behavior. That's part of the question of Szeth himself. Is he going to go back to being, this person who is the assassin in white? Is he going to live his life in the same way that he did, where he had no responsibility because he was truthless? He obeyed his masters who had him do these heinous things that plagued his conscience, and that it seems like he has this connection to the spiritual realm where all of his victims are still crying out for justice. They're still screaming in their death wail at the moment that he killed them. He has a connection to that moment of death for those people who were victims of his, that he did not even care about the agenda that he was carrying out. Is he still going to be that man going forward? Is he just going to follow the rules of the Skybreakers? Rules that reproduce possibly the kind of recidivism that Nail is worried about. Like, are they just going to lock up criminals, or are they going to murder the criminals and maybe risk murdering the wrong person, just like in the scenario of Dalinar? And all of those questions are very, very important as they relate to Dalinar, because like I said, we're going through his backstory, we're going through his memories, and we're discovering that he, Dalinar, is a war criminal. He is a murderer. So the question of like, can a person come back from criminal behavior and be a functional, useful citizen in the world directly applies to Dalinar's journey. And don't forget my claim from the previous book either, that I said Dalinar is a failure in that book. Everything that he tries to accomplish fails in Words of Radiance. Everywhere that he looks, like he puts Amaram at the head of the Knights Radiant, that is the exact wrong person. Every direction that he's looking for something to happen, the solution comes from the opposite direction. He puts Kaladin in prison when Kaladin is the person who should be, the head of the Knights Radiant. He wants to make Shallan a clerk in his administration when Shallan is one of the Knights Radiant that he's been looking for all along, and he just has no clue that that's who she is. And so his history is that of a criminal and a failure as a leader. And this is the guy who is he's the head of the Knights Radiant. He's the king of Urithiru. He seems like exactly the wrong guy for the job. Like when we look at it like this. And I think that's the exact point that Sanderson is making. Dalinar is broken. Dalinar is the wrong person for this job. And that's why it has to be Dalinar, because the entire thing that's happening in the Cosmere, especially in the Stormlight Archive, is that we're taking broken, shattered people and we are rebuilding them. We're putting them back together. And when we do that, we're making them into something new. We're making them into someone better. You can't do that if the person is already good. You can't tell this story if we take Raoden from Elantris and have him be the main character. He's not broken enough. He already has the right idea about what to do. He already knows the answers of how to be a leader of a community and bring people back from the brink. Dalinar doesn't know what he's doing. All of his strategies throughout this book turn in the direction of either trying to be somebody who he isn't, or in trying to be the overbearing Blackthorn from his past, and not the man that he is going to become if he allows his relationship with the Stormfather to progress. So what I mean by that is he tries to be this diplomat who sits in the meeting rooms of Urithiru and, has Navani using the span reed to contact the leaders around the world and tell them, like, hey, the Knights Radiant are back, the Voidbringers are here, and we need to work together. We need to create a global coalition to resist the Voidbringers and fight back against the end of the world. And I'm here to help you do that. I'm here to be the leader of the Knights Radiant. How can I help you today? Right? And that whole thing is a tone and a way of being that does not match the Dalinar Kholin that we meet in the flashbacks. That guy is a guy who, is trying to eat his dinner and can't find his knife and walks out into a high storm to try and find it, and then stops an assassin at the dinner table when he can't find his knife and kills the man, with his own knife, takes the knife from the assassin, slams it into his chest, wipes the blade off, washes it off in his wine, and then starts to cut his steak up and goes, delicious. That is a dude who is not diplomatic, right? Like, that is a guy who is breaking things and is brutal and doesn't blink at committing a murder in the midst of high society feasting. So when you get a phone call or a text message from that guy, in the form of the span reed that says, hey, do you want to be friends and work together forever? You don't trust that guy. That doesn't sound like Dalinar Kholin. It sounds like a trick. And that is how all of the leaders of the world read it. And that's because Dalinar is trying to be somebody who he is not. Maybe that is a noble thing to try and be. Maybe we understand as readers that he's just doing his best and he's trying to do a good job at this, new part of his career. But there's something inauthentic about it. And it goes back to this theme that I've been talking about all the way back to Elantris, but it exists in Mistborn and it's been in every one of the Cosmere stories. It's the signifier and the signified. It's this misalignment of who he seems to be and who he actually is. And everybody can read that off of him. Even though Dalinar's trying to be a different kind of man, the fact is that he is who he is. And he does not find success when those elements of his personality are not aligned with each other. So when he's talking to, the Queen Fen, for example, and he starts yelling at her and telling her, like, it's the end of the world. Are you kidding me? Like, we're going to have negotiations with the enemy. We're not going to fight back against the Voidbringers. Then she's like, oh, there you are. There's the warrior that I know about from history, right? I can trust that this is really you. I can see that this crisis has led you to, be an effective leader. You've learned to challenge or channel that war rage and bloodlust into something constructive instead of destructive. Okay, now I get it. Now I can be part of your coalition. Once there's an alignment between the signal that Dalinar is sending out and the truth of who he is, then he finds success. So that theme that we keep hitting on of the signifier and the signified comes into play once again in Oathbringer. And when you look at the Everstorm, I mean, that thing is really doing the work of changing the signification versus, the signifier. The listeners have been deeply misaligned for thousands of years now because of the magic that, happened to them that stole their identity and their cognition away from them. The Everstorm is restoring that connection to them. It's realigning their signifier with their signified. But the aftermath is not as simple as that dichotomy of good and evil, because in the Cosmere, when we align the signifier with the signified, that is an intrinsic part of the goodness in the Cosmere. It has been since the beginning of this story, right? That's the answer to the magic in Elantris. It's the answer that allows Sazed to become harmony. We can't have this realignment of integrity in an entire people group and then have that produce badness. That would undermine the entire thematic and symbolic building of the universe that Brandon Sanderson has put all this time into, even though it would deliver exactly the scenario that we would expect in this story. It would just destroy everything that he's built. And it shows you the intentionality, I think, in the story. That's one of the huge achievements of the Cosmere. I think for fans of the Cosmere, they see it in the lore, they see it in the plot building, that, this stuff has been well thought out in advance, but it's not just built into the kind of material plot and the gears of the storytelling itself. It's also there symbolically, it's there thematically. Oathbringer was always going to be this pivot point because the themes have built to this place that meets the expectation of the audience and then completely inverts them in exactly the same way that it does for all of the characters. And the mechanism that it uses to do that is the same mechanism that we've done over and over throughout the story. It's not like a surprising new mechanism. We're just realigning the signal of who the listeners are with who they actually are. We're uncovering the deep history of Roshar and finding out that actually the humans are the Voidbringers, and the listeners are the indigenous people. They're the people who belong to the land, and the land belongs to them. That's why they can hear the rhythms of Roshar. All of this has been built into the first two books. And it's like paying off here in the third book in a shattering way that completely changes our experience of this story. But to get back to this question of recidivism and mercy, I think the way that this plays out in Dalinar's story in particular, like he's very worried about like what would be the right thing to do. How does mercy operate? When Nail, who is the herald of justice, talks about this, he talks about recidivism, about, cutting off people's hands, and that how that doesn't really solve the problem. It just makes the problem worse. Szeth is looking at elements of the society where you have the person who runs the prison, and so you have like systemic injustice. That's something that he's really worried about because of the unjust way that he was treated by his society. So he can see that, by having masters who failed him in the way that they deployed him, in unjust ways, he can see that leadership is extremely important to manufacturing justice in society. So he shows a trust in Dalinar when he picks Dalinar as the person who he is going to follow instead of following any particular law as a master. He's going to follow Dalinar Kholin personally as a master because he believes in Dalinar as a leader, even though he knows the history of Dalinar just like everybody else in the world does. That judgment on Szeth's part extends a certain amount of grace towards Dalinar, a certain amount of forgiveness towards Dalinar, and faith in who he is becoming for the future. There's obviously a direct contrast that's being built by the use of Szeth because he served Taravangian, as his master during the second book. And Taravangian and Dalinar have all of these conversations throughout this book about justice and leadership. And when you look at Taravangian, he is someone who also regrets his past actions, but it's not slowing him down in committing new atrocities. In fact, I think that the way that Taravangian sees it, his grief and his guilt over his past actions operates as a kind of payment for those things. And also because he's looking deep into the future towards some kind of like greater good or greater success, that all of this badness that he is doing is going to pay for that eventual good scenario. And that to him, this is good leadership. That, that I think what he expects of Dalinar is that Dalinar reframe his experience of himself, and that he see his past war crimes and atrocities and the murder of his wife as necessary stepping stones to establishing a stable kingdom and society that is now delivering justice and becoming world leaders during a crisis of cosmic proportions, right? That all of those heinous steps along the way were worth it, that those were the price that was paid for Dalinar to be in this position to now save the world. To Taravangian, it's all justified. And so for Dalinar to feel bad about it, it makes emotional sense to Taravangian that he feel guilt, but intellectually, he should kind of get over it or get past it and commit to the actions of like whatever he's got to do to save the world is worth it. And to stop looking backwards in the way that Dalinar is throughout the story. That's the kind of leader that Taravangian was for Szeth. He used Szeth as a tool, to do heinous things to accomplish quote unquote good outcomes or the ends justified the means, right? But what it seems like is that the means just produce more and more bad ends. And it's like a never-ending series of heinous events that, just keep repeating. There's just more and more murders piling up, more and more destabilizing of countries piling up behind Taravangian. And we're not seeing cohesion, rebuilding, and like a strong front against the enemy. Dalinar is trying to build a coalition while Taravangian is trying to tear down the world. And I think that's why Szeth trusts him. He's already seen what this kind of leadership does when it's so utilitarian and calculated. The fact that Dalinar is trying to be different is part of what leads Szeth to trust him. The fact that the Radiants already follow Dalinar leads Szeth to trust him. If we're looking at, the history of people and the idea of recidivism and criminality, this brings back for me Mistborn era 2, right? Like that is very closely examining, leadership and criminal behavior at the same time. Think about Wax and his relationship to like seeing himself as a murderer because he killed his wife. This is a very parallel situation with Dalinar, right? He ran away from the roughs. He ran away from his past into Elendel in order to get away from that guilt, get away from the criminality of destroying the woman that he loved. Dalinar does the same thing. He runs to the Night Watcher and has his past erased so that he can run into the heart of politics and become a more political leader rather than a warlord on the battlefield. But what is the thing that Wax learned in the Bands of Mourning? Like, what is the conclusion that he ends up landing at in that story? He had to face the fact that Lessie was not this like pure victim, right? And that he wasn't this pure perpetrator, that there's more to the world. It's more complicated. People are paradoxes. People are not utterly condemnable. People can come back from criminality because he has Wayne right there as an example. He had a person in his partner who he found in the present moment to be hiding from him and have thrown away the gun and wishing that he did not commit that murder. And so Wax is able to find faith in that present moment that Wayne can come back from the things that he did in the past. And because of that faith in him, I think that Wayne found a way to become a lawman. By being a part of the society with Wax, by them being partners, Wayne is able to stop being a criminal and uphold the law. That focus on the present moment is what Szeth is seeing in Dalinar, and the fact that the past is coming screaming back into this story and hitting everyone so hard, it's destroying the world, is distracting them from the power of the present moment, the way that the present moment allows us to pivot and change things going into the future. And when you think about the climax of this story, that moment where Dalinar reaches into the spiritual realm with one hand, he reaches into the cognitive realm with the other, and he slams all of them together to create the perpendicularity. It's him creating an ever-present moment right now, right here, where his past sins, his future successes, and his present doubt exist as a unity. The landscape itself melds Shadesmar and the physical realm and the spiritual realm, which in itself is a paradox. That melding of the three realms, that presence of all of them right there, is a paradoxical alignment. But it is the power that allows the Radiance to fight back against the enemy of hatred and passion and guilt that Odium represents. It's not that guilt is a bad thing in the story. It's not that these emotions are a bad thing, because I think what we see in a lot of the villainous characters and the antagonists, the characterization of evil in this book has to do with an interior emotional numbness. You look at Moash, you look at Amaram at the end of the story. These are characters who give their guilt and anger and sadness over to Odium, and at the same time, they give over their personal agency, their sense of responsibility. What these characters say over and over and over is, "It's not my fault." That's something that Szeth could easily say, right? Taravangian made these choices, not me. I'm not responsible for the people that I killed because Taravangian just used me like a tool. And so I don't need to feel bad about it. He should feel bad about it. But that's not his approach. This is an important distinction in terms of like who is good and who is villainous in the story. This is a signal to us about what is good and evil in the Cosmere. When you take responsibility for the bad things that you did, but also for the things that were done to you, the things that you had no control over, like the situation that Moash lived through. He didn't have control over what happened to his grandparents, the injustice of it. He didn't have control over the injustice of how dark eyes are treated. Control is not the question. Like, trauma comes out of a lack of control. That's not the issue. The issue is choosing to take responsibility for it. It doesn't mean that that thing is your fault. What taking responsibility for trauma means is that you are asserting your agency. You're saying, this belongs to me and I get to make choices about it. When these characters forego their responsibility as it regards their past, their trauma, their pain, they give up their agency and they become the thing that Szeth was in the hands of Taravangian. They're just tools. They're just another weapon in the hand of Odium. And emotionally, psychologically, it feels safer. There's a relief. It feels better to let go of all of those feelings and just indulge in the lack of weight of those things. But what you forego when you give up the guilt, the self-loathing, the hatred, is all of the other emotions that could also come. And you're also deciding that the destination has arrived before you've gone through the journey, right? You've decided that the rest of my life is going to be characterized by this trauma and there's no coming back from it. So the better choice to make is just to give it up because it's not my fault anyway. So I'm just going to give it away because this is all I'm ever going to feel. That is a very real feeling. You know, if you're trapped in feelings of guilt, in feelings of depression, feelings of loss, it definitely, when you're in the midst of that, feels like this is how it's going to be forever, and you can't imagine a way out. But that's the same kind of thinking that goes back to this question of, you know, one of these people is the person who stole the pigs, and we can't have a society where we don't punish criminals. We need to execute all of them. Like, you're just assuming that the person who stole the pigs, if you let them out, they're just always going to steal pigs forever and ever, and that there's no way to ever come back from that. We've seen that people can come back from it. We've seen Kaladin rebuild himself. We see Shallan in the process of rebuilding herself. We've seen Wayne. Character after character, right? It's possible for people to be shattered and reforged in the Cosmere. That's the central message, I think, of this huge story when we're taking the whole thing in. And it lies at the heart of this novel. That's why I say that Oathbringer is this pivot point for the entire Cosmere. And the emphasis, I think, has to be on that present moment. It's not that the past doesn't matter. It's not that it doesn't count. There's not like a born again kind of moment where you have no responsibility for the things that you did in the past. Now you're a new person and you can just let all that go. That's not what's happening here. It's a recognition of the possibility that is extended to us in every moment of time. So just like that one powerful moment of manifesting the perpendicularity gives all of the Radiant Knights this ability to explosively use their powers in ways that they've never used them before, and to, you know, kind of become a fighting unit together for the first time and, you know, do all of this awesome battling. I mean, it's such a cool moment, you know, just mechanically in terms of the plot and the awesome magic powers and all this stuff. But I think mechanically, it's symbolizing what that present moment, the full potential of it is for every person in the story. And just like Darko Suvin, you know, points out to us when it comes to the novum of the story and our cognitive estrangement, once we've been pulled out of our lives by Oathbringer and see the power of the present moment in the story, we can question in our own lives, should I be regarding myself the way that I do? Should I be looking at my life as if I have no choice but to go forward doing this because that's what I've done in the past, because that's the way that people have always done it? It frees you up as the reader to question how to live your life, because it gives you the agency to step into the present moment and see it as a place of possibility instead of a foreclosed zone that is predetermined by the past. You see this with Renarin in the story, the way that his powers manifest, and he sees that Jasnah is going to come and kill him. He knows that that moment is going to happen because he can see the future. And he submits to it. He kneels down and bares his neck to her so that she can summon her shard blade and kill him in that moment. And Jasnah, because she's a Aristotelian, that's the way that she approaches all of reality, right? She looks at the past to see how the future will unfold. She is doing the very thing that, like how Dalinar is experiencing his guilt and anguish in the story. He's seeing, oh, in the past, I was this terrible, heartless war criminal who murdered my wife. am I going to be that man forever? According to the way that Jasnah studies the world, the answer is yes. That, the Voidbringers are not the Voidbringers. They're the listeners of Roshar. They are the indigenous rightful owners of this world. According to the way that Jasnah sees things, they should abandon Roshar. The humans should. They should leave because that's not where they belong. And that was the cause of the Recreants, that same thinking that if we were criminals in the past, even though we are Knights Radiant, if we as a race of humans are the evil race of epic fantasy, then that means that there is no other way that this story can end than that we will genocide the indigenous good people, right? Therefore, we have to renounce our powers. We have to step away from these abilities and this responsibility because the past has determined the future. Renarin's seeing of what will happen forecloses the possibility of mercy. And then when Jasnah enters into the present moment, she is able to make a different choice to assert her agency and have mercy on Renarin, to choose to believe that he will become a better man than he has been in the past, and that his powers, while they represent a type of corruption in the past, perhaps in the future they will be a source of generative good. And she is only able to locate that mercy in the present moment. She has to throw away what she knows about the past and believe in a new kind of future. She has to overturn her entire ideology. Renarin has to give up his belief that he absolutely knows the future because of his magical powers, because of the mercy that she asserts in that moment for him. And once Renarin understands that the future is not foreclosed, he's able to step into his role as a Knight Radiant more fully. He's able to be there and save his brother Adolin. He's able to fight against the giant monsters and on, because he learns the power of the present moment. I think this gets at the difference between forgiveness and redemption. So this is a misunderstanding that I see a lot in the fan community around this book of like, forgiveness is too easy. That, people do bad things in the world. We see it all the time, especially in online spaces. People behave badly, they ask for forgiveness, and then they just behave badly again. And they're abusing the forgiveness that is extended to them by the community they've built. And so I think online fandom is very wary of how they perceive the message in the story, and that makes sense to me. Emotionally, it feels unfair that Dalinar could be abusive in his marriage to his wife, even though he feels guilty about it in the moments when he does it, and have that culminate in accidentally murdering his wife while committing a war crime, and then he doubles down on the war crime and destroys an entire civilization. And then he is supposed to be the hero of the story, and we're supposed to root for him and feel happy for him at the end of the novel. And that feels emotionally unfair. And what I would say to that is that you're right. It is unfair. And that's the point. That's how forgiveness works. Forgiveness is not fair. If it is fair, then it's not forgiveness, it's redemption. And the two things are related, but they're not the same. And so both forgiveness and redemption are words that etymologically come out of the tradition of finance. So if we look at forgiveness, that is a word that is related to debt. And I think that that is emotionally how we feel about Dalinar through the story, that he has accumulated a debt of bad actions that need to be paid off with good actions or with like actions that restore justice to the people that he treated badly in the past. That would be how to achieve redemption for Dalinar. But instead, what we get is he accumulates all of these bad actions. And once the bad actions pile up to the point that he can no longer stand it, he goes to the Night Watcher, and the thing that he asks for from the Night Watcher is forgiveness. What she delivers to him is taking away the knowledge of what he did and all of the associated feelings of what happened. Financially, he has accumulated a debt, and then the person that he owed the debt to, let's say, in this case, God, said, I forgive the debt, and the debt is taken down to zero. It doesn't exist anymore, okay? And now, in the wake of having no debt, Dalinar learns new skills about how to behave and how to, going forward, build emotional credit. He invests himself into the scripture of the Way of Kings. He holds to the traditions of Alethkar, in terms of like, don't get drunk before a battle, always wear your uniform, be ready for battle, don't put your followers through anything that you wouldn't do, and on, all the ways that he is behaving when we meet him in the Way of Kings in the first novel. All of that is a kind of building of credit, if you will, that is acting towards the redemption side of things. Redemption is about approaching the debts that have been accumulated and paying them off in turn, meeting the full amount of like the principal of the debt and paying it back to the person that or institution that it was borrowed from. If we're talking about the financial etymology of redemption, that is a fundamentally different emotional practice than forgiveness. Forgiveness is about wiping away the debt. Redemption is about paying the debt back. These are not the same. When you wipe away somebody's debt, there is no reason to give them another loan. In fact, it is a terrible idea to give them another loan. Dalinar does not take out another loan, as it were, in this case. He fundamentally changes his behavior because the Night Watcher has trimmed away many of his habits and behaviors when she trimmed away his feelings about the death of his wife and the atrocities of war. This allowed Dalinar to build entirely new habits and entirely new kind of wealth, if you will, of moral behavior. It allowed him to remake himself. She cultivated him. That is what she is, right? She's cultivation. She allowed him to transform and to change. This is the promise of the present moment. This is the playing out of the themes that have been built into this book, into the Cosmere at large. This isn't about Dalinar not having any responsibility for his past, because this story is the story of that past coming back into the present. It's about integrating that debt back into who he is, and that going forward, Dalinar does need to pay this debt back. Now, when it comes to his wife, Evie, in the moment that I was talking about where he reaches into both of the other realms and creates the perpendicularity, in that very moment, he hears the voice of his wife, Evie, speak to him, and she says, I forgive you. And that is the moment that he says to Odium, you cannot have my pain. I am unity. And then he claps his hands together and brings together those universes. So Evie has taken away the debt that she is owed from his actions in that moment. she understands where he's coming from. Who knows if this is real or not? I would suppose that this really is some essence of Evie that has to do with a resonance of the spiritual realm that, does not experience time. And so she was able to, in the moments after her death, the way that we saw in Kelsier's story in the Secret History, how people exist for a little while in the cognitive realm and then they move into the beyond. Maybe she forgave Dalinar and now he's like just getting the message. Because she knows that that debt can drag on a person from the potential of their ability to change in the present moment, their ability to take responsibility in the present and chart a new course. The guilt of a debt that can't be paid back because Evie is already dead could pull Dalinar back into that place that drove him to cultivation in the first place. And so she forgives him. She lets him, allows him to let it go. I don't think that this is a story about Dalinar's redemption. That's a story that has to come later. This is the beginning of his ability to work towards redemption because he did not even know about the emotional debt that he owed. He was forgiven of that debt in a supernatural way where it was taken away from him completely and he was totally unaware of it. This can also be part of the work of trauma. So in The Way of Kings, I talked about Kaladin's trauma and then how that evolved in Words of Radiance and how Kaladin's journey feels emotionally unappealing or dissatisfying because it feels like, hey man, we already went through this in the first book and now you're like stepping backwards into this hatred, you're messing up the opportunities that you've been given. And it had to do with that 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of motion that happens when you're recovering from trauma, when you're dealing with clinical depression, that psychologically we don't have this linear progression of just always moving upwards and always getting better. Instead, there's a kind of falling back that can happen. Maybe things even get worse before they get better. You just fall even more backwards than you did before. I think we're seeing that, symbolically through the magic system here with Dalinar, where magically he has had this experience taken away from him, and now magically it has been restored to him. That is an experience that people have who have gone through extreme trauma, through PTSD. When they start to unpack their PTSD, when they start changing their emotional locus of control, what they do is re-experience their past and unpack the fact that that funny story from my past is actually not funny at all. That was a really traumatic, bad thing, actually. Or I thought that this relationship that I had with this person, that they were really weird the way that they just dumped me from their life. But actually, now that I am able to look back at it, I can see all the ways that I was abusive to that person and I messed things up and that they were right to, protect themselves and create boundaries. Now I have reinterpreted this thing that existed in my past that I wasn't even aware of because the trauma was covering it up, or it had changed the pathways in my brain so that I could not even empathize with these other people the way that I was behaving at the time. As you change as a person and recover from not just the traumatic things that happen to you that you couldn't control, but the traumas that you deal out to other people, it recontextualizes those events in ways that brings them up and feels totally fresh and new and agonizing and traumatic all over again. You're like, oh man, I thought I was past this, but actually I didn't even understand my relationship with this person at all because emotionally I was not equipped to even look at this thing. And what you have to learn as you go through the unwinding of the trauma is that when these things come up the way that it is for Dalinar, the reason that Evie is coming back to him at this time is because he is ready to face it. He is equipped to start the work of redemption. Part of the reason why he is able to work on redemption is because the forgiveness gave him the space to learn new skills. So as you recover from trauma and you get new skills, that will bring up things that you weren't even aware of. But the fact that they're being brought up by your psyche means that your psyche knows now you have the tools to integrate this as well. And the challenge is, will you shrink back from that? Will you dive into numbness? Will you go back to the maladaptive behaviors that feel comfortable and good, but ultimately don't serve your progress? Or will you say to that, whole maladaptive situation, you cannot have my pain, and choose to step forward? You see this story beautifully told in Teft's story in the novel, right? Where Teft is an absence in Kaladin's story, who I'll get to in a moment. We're just purely dealing with Dalinar here so far. But Kaladin, when he shows up every once in a while, is like, where's Teft? And everybody's like, Teft's not here. Because he's fallen back into this addiction that he has. And addiction is a really big theme in this book that I have not brought up at all, but is probably worth talking about here. Clearly, this is an adaptive behavior that Teft moved into during his time of soldiering to numb the pain of his relationship with his family, his guilt over how he turned them into the authorities and, lost his entire community. And then on top of that, it turns out that the community was right about everything that they were predicting, even if they were going about how they coped with it in completely inappropriate and wrong ways. Teft has fallen back into addiction, and he is betraying his rank. He is, selling his clothes in order to get another hit. He's staying out all night long at the drug dealer place, and he can't even pick himself up off the floor anymore. And even though Bridge 4 is there for him, he's kind of exploiting their good behavior of forgiving him in selling his uniform and shirking his duties. He's not carrying his part of the load for them. And again, you see that act of forgiveness from Bridge 4 where they're saying, don't worry about the debt. We just want you to get better, and giving him the space to build the skills to get to the point where he can start working on redemption. But with addiction, it's incredibly difficult because of the chemical dependence in the body pulling you back, it's not just about willpower. It's something more fundamental in the biology that overcomes what you might intend in your mind. But in exactly the same way, we find out that, Teft has been broken by his experiences and his trauma, and that has put cracks in his soul, which has invited in one of the honor spren who is filling up those cracks with the investiture and allowing him to take the oaths. And so he's taken the first oath of journey before destination, life before death, strength before weakness. But he's kind of failing at all of those things. And then he comes to the second oath of protecting those people that even if he hates them, he will protect them, even if the person that he hates the most is himself. We see here that the oaths are slightly different for each individual knight, that they are going on a personal spiritual journey that has to do specifically with their own trauma. So for Kaladin, the person that he hated was all of the Light Eyes, who betrayed not just him personally, but his notions about the goodness of his own society, the potential of the leaders that he chose to have faith in and who betrayed that faith. For Teft, it's about having faith in himself, about learning to trust himself again, because the person who has failed him over and over again is himself. It's, the biology of his body has betrayed the intentions of his mind. And so he's come to hate himself. And that self-loathing is the same feeling that Moash has, but his response to it is to give up his responsibility in the moment. And Teft steps into that place of responsibility and asserts that going forward, his behavior will change to the best of his ability. And he talks to Kaladin about it. He says, it's not fair. I thought I'd be somebody else. This is the experience of therapy. This is the experience of getting through trauma, of confronting addiction. You don't get to be a different person. You're still going to have to carry that past. The work of redemption is paying down that debt from the past. Forgiveness is just this first step on that path. It's making the space to build the new skills that are requisite for the redemption to happen. So once he takes that step of asserting his responsibility in the moment, stepping into that intention of the present moment for building a better future, that's where he becomes the person who saves the day. He's the cavalry coming in to save Kaladin in the way that Bridge 4 does again and again, right? Kaladin built Bridge 4. He saved all of those men. And over, that community steps back into the gap for him and saves him. He's facing Amaram, his antagonist for the past couple of books, and he's not able to save himself in that moment, but Bridge 4 is able to step in and deliver him that victory. They're able to save him from his own confrontation with the past. So it seems like I'm done talking about Dalinar and that I've moved on to Kaladin, whether I was conscious of it or not. So let's just lean into it. Let's just go into Kaladin's story, which I think really troubles the way that we've been dealing with radical empathy and community building so far in the Cosmere. And I've already talked about this as it relates to White Sand and Sixth of Dusk and Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell, that, starting in Elantris, we had this building of community is a good thing. It lifts people up. It fills in the cracks in their soul. We've seen it in Mistborn and in the Stormlight Archive with Bridge 4. But there's a dark side to empathy. There's a dark side to community building that in White Sand and in Sixth of Dusk and the Forests of Hell, self-resilience is also a virtue, that entering into the community leads to parasitic relationships that will drain a person, that will exploit people, and that we've seen that in the theme of slavery on Roshar, right? Where all these humans can do over and over again is enslave everything that they encounter. And I think that psychologically that comes from a place of projecting onto everything that they encounter this disavowal of responsibility and this following of their passions, that their god was odium, the god of human passion, and that so the way that they're built, if you will, spiritually, is to lapse into that emotionality at a moment's notice instead of taking responsibility for what they've done. They just act the way that, Dalinar did in the midst of battle. They just give in wholesale to their feelings of wrath and competition and triumph. And this leads to dysfunctional outbursts that, they can't trust anybody else because the way that they feel is like, okay, at a moment's notice, I could just, go off the deep end and lose it and throw a tantrum. Therefore, I'm going to assume that everyone around me has the same disposition. Therefore, I need to dominate everyone around me. I need to enslave everything that can be enslaved around me because I am already enslaved to my emotions. There's no chance that I can take responsibility for my feelings and cope with them and build something functional. Therefore, no one else is capable of that either. And therefore, I need to master them so they don't get in the way of me being able to have a tantrum whenever I need to. That's kind of the whole way that Roshar is built, in terms of the human society. They've enslaved the listeners, they've enslaved the Spren, they've enslaved the Dark Eyes. Anything that they can encounter and enslave, they will absolutely do it. That is a very dysfunctional way to project your internal empathy on everything around you and to build a community around that. So community building and empathy is not always a good thing in the Cosmere. I don't want to paint it as this, simple thing. And I think the way that Sanderson draws things to a fine point in Kaladin's story emphasizes this. It makes it really jump out in the story of Oathbringer, that he goes to his home with all of the expectations that we have along with him of the epic fantasy story, that the Voidbringers are here, they're going to murder his family, and things are going to be bad when he gets back to Hearthstone. But when he gets back to his community, everyone's fine. The Parshmen have run away. Things are pretty much the same way that they were when he left. And he manages to track down where the Parshmen are going. They're all making their way to the capital city. And by and large, they come off as normal Alethi people. They're just part of the same community that Kaladin grew up in for his entire life. But they've been disconnected from their ability to integrate their past. They're going through the exact same experience that Dalinar is going through in the novel, where they had this part of who they were taken away from them, and now it's been restored to them, and they're just trying to cope with that and build skills that will allow them to have a future. So they're not these terrible monsters, they're just people. They're just another group of people in this same land, and they share in all of the cultural history and traditions. Like, they play the same card games, they speak the same language with the same accent. And we see this over and over when we encounter the listeners all around the world. They have the same cultural identity as the place that they came from. The Thaylen listeners are Thaylen, the Azish listeners are Azish, and these Rosharan listeners are Rosharan. And so immediately they are part of the same community as Kaladin, and what he starts to do with them is build a community. This is what Kaladin does. He turns them into like another Bridge 4. He starts to identify them with them. He starts to empathize with them. And I think what Kaladin is doing on a more fundamental level, and this is going to build up to something different in the forthcoming Stormlight Archive books, is that he is not executing the war. That there is a plan that a war is going to happen against the Voidbringers, and we, the Knights Radiant, are going to execute that war, and we're going to win because we're on the side of honor and justice and good, right? Kaladin is not doing the plan. Like, you cannot build a community and have empathy for somebody and execute a war at the same time. Those are two competing, non-conforming ways of interacting with people. And what Kaladin quickly realizes is that he is not going to be able to fight the listeners if he keeps doing this. He's not going to be able to participate in the war effectively if he sees them as, fully agentic people in the world like he is, who have hopes and dreams and desires for a community that are just as valid as his own parents and family. And I think that beyond just troubling the idea of community building and empathy and the intrinsic goodness of that in the Cosmere, this goes on to point out the way that there's some subjectivity to Kaladin's bond to Syl, that she is not a direct pipeline to capital T truth in the universe or justice or what have you, that she is not like in touch in some fundamental way with the hard and essential goodness of the universe. Now, I think that goodness does exist in a hard and materialist way, as I've been claiming throughout this entire project, but it doesn't exist in the way that Kaladin necessarily wants it to, or even the way that Syl perceives it to necessarily. Kaladin points out to her how all of this is kind of relative, that it's good for him to defend his community and his people, but somehow it's not good for the Parshmen. She's not able to change her perspective, in other words, to be empathetic with the enemy when it comes to defending people. She sees things in a one-sided way that works with the way that Kaladin sees the world, and they kind of have a meeting or a collaboration that generates their sense of honor within the bond that they share. So honor is not necessarily this hard and fast, unchanging signified, but that the signifier of their perception of honor in some way moves the target, if you will, at least a little bit. I think there are limits to it in the same way that we see the limits of, artistic expression for Shai and the Emperor's soul, that there's only so far that she could take the Emperor before the personality simply won't cohere. In the same way, I think there are hard limits to how far Kaladin could take his sense of honor and still be within the margins of what is acceptable, but there's not hard and fast rules that tightly contain and require Kaladin to behave in particular ways. The significance of what that means is that it locates some agency in Kaladin. He has a certain responsibility for defining what honor is, not only on the personal level within his bond, but this gets, projected outwards into the larger society as well, and has effects across, all of his culture, because these listeners are a part of his culture. By making friends with them, by teaching them, by starting to build a community with them, he is enfolding them within the community of honor as he sees it. And he realizes that this will cause trouble if he needs to execute a war on them, which should be a pretty strong signal that maybe war is not a functional part of honor as, part of the signifier-signified equation. But Kaladin exists in this mindset that to be a warrior, to be a soldier, is to be honorable, that there is something honorable in being a soldier that you can kill in order to protect. And so for right now, I think he sees he sees war as a requisite condition of honorable behavior. And so entering into empathy and community with his enemy is disruptive and dysfunctional to the execution of that honor. He can't do it because he can't be honorable and be empathetic and community building at the same time. Why can't he be that? Because of his own perceptions of what honor is, at least in this point of the story. And so nonetheless, he does come to care about these listeners. He makes friends with Sa, and that bond, is in place once he leaves to go back to Urithiru and Dalinar and to follow more orders. In a sense, it's kind of already too late. Like he has included Sa into the community. By the time he realizes that he has done that and runs away from it, it's already present in, inside of his way of seeing the world. And once you're included in the community for Kaladin, then, when it comes to honor, he needs to defend you. He needs to save you. You're one of the people that he is responsible for now. And while all of that seems to be good, it plays exactly against his ability to perform warfare on Sa. And so the same, exact situation that has happened to Kaladin so much happens when he goes back and he is sent into harm's way in Kholinar. He goes on a mission with Elokar, who, he was part of the plot to kill Elokar in the previous book, and now he's fully redeemed that relationship. This is a good example of redemption, I think, in the narrative, where he's kind of paid back that debt to Elokar by standing up to Moash when he didn't have powers, by safely hiding Elokar, after he regained his powers, and making sure that the king is safe and reunited with his family. Kaladin successfully paid off the debt of being part of the conspiracy to kill him in the first place. So he didn't need to be forgiven for that. He paid back the debt of it, is kind of what I'm pointing out. And so Elokar trusts him. He, again, is his bodyguard and takes him into the heart of the kingdom, but are also like the heart of darkness, if you will, like literally the heart, with the heart of the rebel. And they confront the queen, who has been taken over by an evil presence. And Moash shows up, who serves as a foil for Kaladin's story, a kind of dark opposite to who Kaladin is, where Kaladin has taken more and more responsibility. Moash has taken less and less responsibility personally, and has given into his desires for personal justice and revenge, instead of taking responsibility for the well-being of everyone around him. And he makes friends, Moash does, with the same parshmen, with Sa, that Kaladin did as well. And he kind of impresses the leadership of the listeners, and they trust him and include him in their military plans and deploy him to, confront Kaladin in this moment. And he ends up leading Sa and the other refugee listeners that Kaladin made friends with against the soldiers inside of the city, who Kaladin also becomes friends with and a leader of, and starts to mentor. So like everywhere he goes, he's building community, he's making connections with people, he's improving people's lives by building these communities. But because of the dysfunctional way that Roshar is fixated on war and violence, it directly throws these communities into conflict with each other. And so the listeners and the soldiers confront each other and kill each other. And so he has friends who are killing other friends, and he doesn't know who to step into the gap for and defend and protect. This, very directly attacks Kaladin's savior complex, where he needs to step into the lives of everyone and save them from whatever is happening. You can't save people from this circumstance where you've built a community over here and you built another community over here, and now those two communities are going to destroy each other. You have to make a choice of one community or the other, it seems like. And that is a choice that he can't make. He's trapped by this need to save everyone, and it paralyzes him. And the price that is paid is Elokar's life. And it is a further fall for Moash as part of the price as well. His friend, this person who betrayed him, but also who he still cares about. It feels like Moash, at that moment where he kills Elokar, becomes utterly lost to Kaladin and is never going to find his way into redemption. And Kaladin shuts down in a kind of mental way, in an emotional way. He's completely paralyzed and unable to deal with the situation I don't think it's a coincidence that symbolically the party then enters into Shadesmar, that they leave the physical world and then go into this bizarre world that is the cognitive realm, right? Because that is the same zone that Kaladin has entered into in this moment, that he is trapped in his own mind. And now, that's the symbolic reality of what's happening, but Sanderson literalizes it in the story. He makes it a material reality that now Kaladin is trapped in the mind of the world. And he has to confront this contradiction that he's built for himself and start to realize the incompatibility of war with community building, but also the way in which he's kind of getting in his own way, that the requirements, the responsibilities that Kaladin has stepped into, we talk about agency and responsibility earlier with Dalinar. There's a way in which Kaladin has overstepped his responsibilities. He has a dysfunctional relationship with responsibility. He takes on too much of it. He says, I need to save everyone in the world. Everyone that I encounter is part of my community. I need to save my community. This is not possible for him. He can't save everybody. And this is something that he needs to reckon with. And this is another step along the path in failing to save everybody, in encountering a paradoxical situation where he's not able to achieve the salvation of his friends. He has to confront the ways in which his sense of responsibility is dysfunctional to his own personal progress. And for the first time in these books, Kaladin fails to progress in his oaths. He's not able to say the next oath in the progression because he's deadlocked by not just the incompatibility of community and war making, but the incompatibility of the responsibility that he's taken versus the responsibility that the oaths require. So again, there's a misalignment there of, the signification of Kaladin to himself of who he is misaligned with the actual signifier of who he is as a person. He's not fully aligned in ways, and that is what leads to his failure in this book to progress. And I think his overall failure in the book to execute his desired role in, the military, the thing that he sees for himself is that he is a killer who can protect, that he can do a good thing by killing. And he's not able to do that in this book because he can't even fight at all. But when he goes into the cognitive realm, he is able to come into contact with a vision of the future that tells him that Dalinar, the most important part of his community, maybe because, that's his direct commander, the person who could kind of override his sense of responsibility here, is going to be in incredible danger, and that he needs Kaladin to be there to help him. And so what Kaladin is doing for the rest of the story, in trying to get to Dalinar and eventually achieving that, is not only, having faith that Dalinar is worth supporting and saving and all of that nice kind of thing, but actually I think what he's doing is the exact kind of thing that Moash is doing and that Dalinar is tempted to do in his relationship with Odium. He's going to someone that he can give up his sense of responsibility to and just follow orders to get over this deadlock, this impasse of not knowing who his enemy and who his friends are, and not being able to differentiate between, his ally and his enemy. Dalinar is going to point him in a direction and allow him to kind of instrumentalize himself and get back to the virtue of being a warrior, the simplicity of defending one group and destroying the other group. But in a sense, it's already too late. Like, that represents a kind of, one step back thing, kind of once again for Kaladin, that he's already encountered the Parchment. He already knows that they're just people, that they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to build a community. And in the same way that everybody encounters the truth of, the fact that the humans are the Voidbringers and the listeners are the indigenous people, Kaladin has already encountered the fact that the listeners are people, and that it's going to be necessary going forward to build a community with them, or to just utterly forego responsibility and throw it all away, the way that the Radiants did in the Recreants before. But I don't think that Kaladin can take that step, because he's already seen what that would do to Syl. He's already experienced losing the bond and almost killing her. I don't think he can step back into doing that again, because there's a way in which he needs to save Syl, because he has to save everybody in his community. He has that loyalty to her that he has that plays into his kind of savior complex problem. And so on the one hand, that's kind of saving his foregoing of responsibility. But I think he wants to move back into the simplicity of being a soldier who takes orders. And he gets to do that, in that climactic battle to a certain degree. But it's very evident that going forward, it's not going to be that simple. He's going to have to make a choice about this distinction between warfare and community as his story progresses, or he's going to have to just settle for never progressing in his oaths again and just kind of stagnating spiritually. Which brings us to the third tritagonist, Shallan. And I think that theme of addiction that I was talking about earlier, how that plays into Dalinar's story, where we already knew from the Way of Kings and stuff that he had a drinking problem in his past, but we see the way that, like, the reasons that was happening. It's similar to Teft. It's a coping mechanism. It's a maladaptive behavior that has to do with obliterating his feelings, this same foreclosure of responsibility, giving away of the heavy burden to the alcohol, the same way that, supernaturally Odium is inviting him to do and become his champion. He'll take all of the pain away. He'll take all of the responsibility away. That's what the alcohol was providing to Dalinar in the flashback part of his story. Shallan also starts to flirt with developing a drinking problem here, but I think it's a little bit different for her. But her art is definitely a kind of coping mechanism and also an addiction. She kind of compulsively returns to the art again and again and again throughout the story. And, her story overall in a much larger way, that she retreats into the art, and again, it kind of forces her to encounter the truth, because I think of the way that Sanderson has calibrated art in the Cosmere, this kind of supernatural art that Shallan is dealing with, that has margins that intersect with the truth, that there's a way that, good art operates in the Cosmere. It can only be good if it is encountering the truth or dealing with the truth, that it's in contact with truth in some way. And so even though she uses it as an escape from reality, fundamentally it returns her to reality because of its essential nature. And so even the art itself can't allow her to escape. But in her story, she kind of escalates her dysfunction via the art of trying to escape herself. She's come back into contact with the guilt of her past, just like Dalinar has, just like the world itself is, as it's coming into a full knowledge of what was done to the listeners. She destroyed the people who gave her life. She destroyed the safety of her home, the emotional reality of her father. She killed her parents, this kind of unspeakable thing that she has to face. Now she can't look away from it anymore, but she has these responsibilities that she's not able to offer herself forgiveness for those actions. Part of the progression of her radiant group, in encountering the truth, it has nothing to do with necessarily synthesizing that truth, with integrating that truth. There's no tools in place for Shallan to do that. She's just encountering kind of the walls of her interior psychic experience, right? Where she's like, that's what this whole book is about, I think, for Shallan. Like, she's just kind of emotionally pinballing through the experience of being a Knight Radiant and running into the boundaries of what is okay to do. And that's where the alcohol kind of plays into it. She's becoming an adult. She's going out into the world and being like, okay, well, if I'm going to be this infiltrator into the lower classes of society, this kind of spy who is able to move amongst the ghost bloods and the other criminals of the world, then I need to be the kind of woman who can handle her liquor, right? That means I need to drink some hard liquor for the first time in my life. And it's a very funny scene. It's very endearing. It's clever the way that it works with the magic system, and she's able to just like instantly burn off all of the effects of the alcohol and make that seem like part of her persona of Veil. But I think it emphasizes the way that Shallan is experimenting with things. She's moving out into new comfort zones and trying out new things and finding the edges of what she is able to handle, while she also fundamentally believes that the one thing that she is definitely not able to handle is encountering herself. She is constantly avoiding that contact with herself to whatever degree is possible. And so chasing things like alcohol, falling into her art, are coping mechanisms for not coming into contact with that past that she is hiding from herself, instead of the way that Dalinar is experiencing his past, where it was hidden from him or kind of existed beyond a veil of forgiveness that is now kind of foreclosed and now the debt is due. Shallan just believes that that debt is incalculably high and can never be redeemed. There's nothing that she could ever do to pay that back. And so the best thing to do is to run from the creditors, right? There's no forgiveness of the debt possible. She just has to run forever and ever and ever, is the approach that she has been taking for this, entire 3 series of books. And I don't think she really lets up in this book. The way that she doubles down is by, instead of just pouring her attention and her time into drawing pictures or making paintings or learning more about art or becoming more of an academic, she completely seals off her personality and creates a new persona, an entirely new personality, where she can give up the responsibilities of being Shallan. She can give up the past of being the person who killed her parents and instead inhabit the life of this person who never committed those kind of heinous things that can never be redeemed. So in creating Veil, she creates a personality of a person who I think in her imagination is like much cooler than her, right? Like a hard-bitten, dark-eyed woman who has grown up on the streets, has all kinds of abilities that she doesn't, and know-how that she will never have. And then she also creates the persona of Radiant in order to learn how to be a person who can touch the shard blade without encountering the guilt and the memories of the presence of her mother and the consequence of having to kill her father. Just like Wayne from Era 2 Mistborn can't pick up a gun after the trauma of committing murder by shooting a man, Shallan hates the shard blade that is Pattern and can't encounter it without bringing that past trauma into the present moment and then having that feeling that the debt can never be repaid. So instead of picking up the shard blade, she has Radiant do it. She creates an entirely different personality who she is not necessarily invested in psychically, but who she can give away her personal responsibility to, and then, emerge into this persona that is able to bond with Adolin over sword fighting. And then she constructs a false past for Radiant where she's like, oh, she was always good at this and that. Her body is even different. She's just like trying to be a totally different person who is not herself. And I talked about with Dalinar how when he tries to be the diplomat, how that fails because there's that misalignment of signified and signifier. What Shallan is doing here is a little bit more complicated than that because she's fragmenting the signified into these other signified personas. She is not identifying herself as like, I am Shallan pretending to be Vale. We see this represented mechanically in the language that Sanderson is choosing in the moments of depicting her characterization. So we're always in the third person in the story, but it's a very close third person where we can experience the thoughts and feelings of the characters. Wherever Sanderson would typically say, Shallan did this, Shallan did that, instead, he says, Vale did this, and Radiant did that. And then Shallan felt this way about Vale. In other words, there's a disentangling of these personalities, and they become distinct versions where she can switch from one to the other, and it's not like just a costume she's putting on, in other words, it's an entirely different character. That's how it's being presented to us linguistically within the mechanics of the story. And I think what that signals to us is that is the interior experience of Shallan herself. I think this actually is a microcosm playing out of the story of Adonalsium that we were told in The Secret History by Chris, where she's like, oh yeah, there was this singular god of the universe, and then 16 people conspired against him somehow and fragmented him into all of these distinct pieces that have this intent built into them, and then they absorbed that power and they became the 16 gods of the Cosmere, right? We see a fragmentation of Shallan. There's even hints in the story that, Shallan herself is a kind of persona or put on of a more fundamental version of Shallan, at least in how she regards herself, that is a more feral, angry, defensive, sad, pathetic creature wrapped in all of these lies that insulate her from contact with her past. That Shallan is just another persona that, just because we met her initially doesn't mean that she's fully real in the ways that maybe we're assuming, that perhaps she is a shard of a more fundamental Shallan, if you will, that Vale and now Radiant are also expressions of. But just like honor and preservation and odium and ruin are incomplete expressions of Adonalsium, and therefore dysfunctional expressions of Adonalsium, I think Vale and Radiant operate the same way. They're dysfunctional expressions of who Shallan really is. They are related to her. They are part of who she is, but they are not the whole story of who she is, and therefore they don't have access to everything that is the potential of Shallan, and they're kind of, at the same time that they're protecting her, they're also holding her back. And so this is related like I keep saying that Kaladin and Shallan are kind of the yin yang, that they reflect each other in a mirror image kind of way. Kaladin is overextending his responsibility and kind of getting in his own way. Shallan is kind of getting out of her own way by creating these other personas that are instead trying to walk down the progression of her spiritual and radiant path for her. But they can't do that. She has to walk down the path. She's the one who has to encounter and integrate truth into herself. She can't create other personas to do it for her. And what it does is fragment and injure her ability to encounter the real world. She's not sure what's true about her past, what's true about her present, because she can't trust her own perceptions anymore. Her light weaving abilities, her ability to misrepresent reality, cause her to mistrust her own perceptions because she is deliberately fragmenting her experience of reality. So she's kind of like gotten out of her own way to the point where she doesn't even know who or where she is. And so when Shallan confronts Ray Shafir in Urithiru, when she goes down to like the sub-basement, kind of core of what makes Urithiru work, and finds this imitator who never projects what it itself is, but instead emanates all of these imitations of what it perceives around it. That's a foil or a representation of Shallan's dysfunction. It's giving us a mirror into, who Shallan is and what she is dealing with. She sees herself as a monster. And here is the monster in a material way manifest for us in the story. And it gives Shallan something to directly confront. And again, the way that she fights against this, if you will, it's not this direct confrontation. Like think back to Edge Dancer and how I talked about how Lift confronts Nail, right? It's not this epic battle of Shard Blade against Shard Staff, I guess. It is this embracing, this radical empathy and connection between people that undoes Nail. And it's similar here with Ray Shafir, that she touches Ray Shafir's flesh and connects to it in a fundamental way and reveals herself fully to Ray Shafir, shows Ray Shafir, I am a monster. Look at the monstrous element that sits at my core. And Ray Shafir, is seen by her. And that is the thing that Ray Shafir cannot stand. It is trying not to be seen. That is the whole point of all of its imitations. It's an emanation of illusion, of covering up what it is. That is its fundamental nature. And so to be seen is the exact antidote to its presence, and it has to leave. And I think that is how Shallan feels about herself, that if she was fully seen in that way, if the monstrous element inside of her was encountered, whoever encountered it would run away. This is directly challenged by the end of the story with Adolin, where he can perceive that the way that Shallan is trying to deal with her, her coping mechanism of creating these personas is not safe for her. It's not serving her very well. And he looks into her eyes and is able to see like, okay, that's Veil. Okay, that's Radiant. Even though he doesn't have names for those women, he can see that it's not the person who he fell in love with, who he is connected to. And when the narrative tells us that it's Shallan who peeks back at him, then the excitement and passion enters his face, and he can see that deep part of her, in other words, the part that she is sure is the monster and will cause whoever encounters it to retreat. And that's the part that he's in love with. That's the part that he wants to spend the rest of his life with. The part that he accepts. The part that is beautiful. That's the thing that Wit tells her in the story about, all humans are monsters. Shallan has encountered herself as a foreclosed destination. There is no journey to go on. There is no redemption to be had in her mind. That is why all of this dysfunction is happening with her, because she believes that fundamentally, deep down in herself, she is unlovable, monstrous, murderous, and evil. And until she lets go of that, she can't really progress. Like, that is kind of the ultimate truth that she's going to have to reckon with in her spiritual journey. Because that's not the way of the Knight Radiant. You can't be at the destination. You have to go on the journey. And confronting that requires strength, not the weakness of foreclosing your responsibility to your spiritual progression. Because giving up being Shallan and just allowing Radiant and Veil to do all the work is to accept death and not to accept life. So we see this very dysfunctional, out of alignment behavior that Shallan has with the oaths that she's taken as a Knight Radiant to prioritize journey before destination, strength before weakness, and life before death. She's doing the exact opposite in creating these personas. At the same time, this is part of the exploration of boundaries that's necessary when we are looking for the truth in our lives. We are going to make mistakes. We are going to overextend. We're going to move in inappropriate directions. We're going to try out drinking or drugs or inappropriate attractions, the way that she's attracted to Kaladin and explores that attraction. These are not necessarily evil behaviors. They're very natural feeling in the dark for the boundaries of the room that she's in, if you will. They're not the expressions of a fundamentally bad person in the way that I think Shallan sees herself. And honestly, the way that a lot of the fandom encounters Shallan. They see her as a fundamentally bad person and, oh, look, here's the privileged woman behaving badly once again, doing bad things to good people. I think what the story is about is a woman who is deeply traumatized and does not trust herself, and she has very good reasons to not trust herself, fumbling in the dark, trying to find the way forward. And since she doesn't trust herself to form a community that will help to uplift her, she creates this virtual community that can take the responsibility away from her for finding progress, but also that she is not going to inevitably betray and perhaps destroy the way that she did her parents. How can she invest in relationships with people when she's probably going to destroy them? That's how she sees it. It's irresponsible for her to do that. That's how she can't trust herself to build those relationships and build those communities the way that Kaladin does, because inevitably she feels that she's going to turn on them and annihilate them. So given all of those beliefs, whether they're true or not, this is the only way to make progress, to stumble in the dark and to feel your way through it. But the lesson of Ja'anat, I think, is that when you fully expose your vulnerability to the world, that is what causes the monsters to run away. That is the moment where pure light explodes from Shallan and expels the darkness. It's when the treasure of Urithiru is restored to the Knights Radiant, right? But that's not the lesson that Shallan learns from that encounter. What she sees it as is, I showed you the monster in my heart and it scared you enough to make you run away. So her framing of the situation is dysfunctional and inappropriate, but that's to be expected, given this whole 2 steps forward, 1 step backward kind of motion that is happening with recovering from trauma. And after her confrontation with Ja'anat and she re-encounters Yasna, who starts to create these hard boundaries around her and demands accountability and responsibility from her, she runs away from that. She runs away from that structure. She runs away from the possibility of this authority figure of Yasna, this kind of mother figure in her life, fully encountering who she is becoming, coming into contact with Veil or Radiant, and therefore kind of stripping away her protections against this core monster self that she believes she is, and therefore would probably, ruin her relationship with Yasna at the very least, if not maybe destroy Yasna, which is what Shallan believed she did in the past anyway. She runs away to Kholinar, and she fully invests in Veil's reality in a way that is inappropriate beyond the boundaries of the aesthetic essentialism that I talked about in The Emperor's Soul. So Shai was unable to create an emperor who, did not have the favorite color of green, because that was in touch with some kind of essential reality, like in the spiritual realm, probably, that has to do with who he fundamentally was as a person. And so while she had a certain margin that she could play with when it came to the Emperor's personality and his personal history, there were boundaries that could not be crossed without the art of creating a personality failing. So that's why I made the claim that there's an essential aesthetic realism to the Cosmere. There are hard limits to what composes good art. Shallan also encounters that when she goes to Kholinar. She sets Veil up as this kind of Robin Hood figure who is robbing the food from the rich and the decadent and redistributing it to the hungry and needy. Somewhat like Lift did in Edge Dancer, right? But when Lift did it, she is a character who actually is in contact with a personal past that has to do with the trauma of living on the streets and understanding, gangland behaviors and on like that. Shallan grew up in a mansion. She is a rich woman, a privileged woman. And she doesn't know the first thing about how gangs think or how people live on the street. And she's not operating from a place of empathy. She's operating from a place of imagination that is being projected onto the poor people of Kholinar that she believes she is helping. And that misalignment of the margins of her personal history, of Veil's personal history, with the reality of the fact that Veil is not a person who actually exists at all, causes the catastrophic collapse of the community around her and gets the children who are trying to help her killed. It empowers the gangs who are exploiting the local neighborhood that she believed she was helping. In other words, she totally failed in the goals that she was trying to commit to as Veil, and it exposed the way in which Veil doesn't really exist at all. Her art of creating a character fell apart because she went outside the boundaries, the margins of what is acceptable art in creating the persona. When she does this, she has a similar collapse to what happens in Kaladin's story, and it happens at the same moment, right? Where she has been moving into this further and further addiction of her art and of her avoidance of herself, and she found the boundary of the limit of how far she could go with that coping mechanism and experienced the kind of psychic and spiritual collapse that was the consequence of it. The problem for Kaladin was that he built too much community, and his savior complex got in his own way, and this forced him to confront the way that he is personally a failure because he's holding himself up to these standards that cannot be achieved. But at the same time, he has these expectations that the only way to be honorable is to execute war. And so it's incompatible to build community and execute war at the same time. And that incompatibility deadlocked him and forced him to confront the reality of the situation that he built for himself. Similarly, but kind of oppositely, I don't think that's a word, Shallan has created this situation where she has indulged in her addictions. She has retreated from community so much that she is not even in community with herself, and she has given up her personal responsibility for her own actions and projected it into a person that she believes is fully formed, but the art cannot sustain that lie. And it collapses under its own weight. It's not in contact with the truth, which is a kind of fundamental element of what's necessary, not only for her radiant progression, but for art itself in the Cosmere. And so in experiencing that collapse, it forces Shallan to come back to the surface of her consciousness and fully experience her failures and her relationships with people, the reliance of everyone around her, and the way that reliance in her mind has gotten people killed. And so for Kaladin, by creating community, he has failed. And for Shallan, by retreating from community, she has failed. This, again, points out how there is no one correct way to move through the space in terms of like building rules around morality in the Stormlight Archive to navigate moral progression, spiritual progression. There isn't one way to do it because you have these two opposite ways of approaching the problem, and they are both failures. It would seem like one would be the answer to the other, but we see that they are both the wrong answer. They're the wrong way. The reason for that, I think, is related to a philosophical concept that's called Aristotelian Virtue Ethics. So this comes from the name Aristotle, who was a Greek philosopher in ancient Greece. He was the tutor to Alexander the Great, the student of Plato, the great philosopher of Athens. And he came up with an entire moral system, Aristotle did, that had to do with moderation. So he didn't assume that any one action or even inaction was necessarily good or bad in and of itself, but needed to be examined in the full context of the situation that it was deployed, and then to be measured against extremities of that behavior. So that's a lot of like big technical highfalutin words. So let me drag that back down to earth and apply it to the Cosmere here. That you have this extreme possibility of behavior of community building for Kaladin that is dysfunctional and inappropriate for the goals that he has of being a warrior who executes warfare. It's not virtuous of him, in other words, to build community. It's not a good thing for him to do if he wants to be a person who commits warfare. If he's going to build community, he needs to moderate that impulse and only build communities that operate within the role of being a warrior. In other words, he can't make friends across the line of the enemy camp. He just can't do that. It's dysfunctional and not virtuous. In the same way, Shallan is retreating from building community to an extreme polarity, to the point where she's completely disengaged from reality, and it's not allowing her to function within her role of encountering and depicting the truth in her art. She needs to be more in contact with herself and the people around her in order to correctly perceive what is real and not real, so that her art can then be in touch with the boundaries of, reality and therefore correctly depict it. So her virtue lies in moderating the distance that she pulls back from community for. It's a similar thing to Dalinar. He's a man who feels very passionately, who is very powerful, and he believes that he needs to have rules to restrain that power, to channel it appropriately, but that he can create these rules and situations that are out of proportion with what is appropriate for his goals. So, for example, he wants to be a diplomat, so he creates all of these rules that are not necessary about what it means to be a diplomat. He restrains his behavior of, how he would usually act in a situation, and says like, no, I can't say it that way because that would not be diplomatic of me. Well, in doing that, he goes too far, and therefore his behavior is not virtuous in an Aristotelian sense. In being more moderate, he would demonstrate virtue by being authentic to himself. He would accomplish the diplomacy in a better, more functional way, and that would be virtuous because he's being moderate. So the entire point of Aristotelian virtue ethics is that you are not extreme in your behavior, but that your approach is appropriate to the circumstance that you're finding yourself in. It's not about following rules, it's about following kind of the vibe of the circumstances that you find yourself in. And I think that's how the Cosmere itself calibrates its morality. It's what we're seeing over and over again, because we're getting examples of this is good behavior. Okay, can we make a rule out of that? Well, here's a counterexample where that same behavior is actually bad. And in examining the way in which the behavior is good over here, but bad over there, what we can see is that the goodness tends to follow a kind of golden mean in between these polarities. That when we're not being extreme in one direction or the other, that's when goodness emerges. And I think it's part of the reason why in this story, responsibility is so important, because it centers the authority of the person in contact with the problem, but also with the present moment. So it brings them fully into the circumstances that they are experiencing, and that is the information that's necessary for them to find where those extreme boundaries lie. That's kind of what I was saying about Shallan's entire journey in this book. She's exploring those boundaries, those extreme edges, and then pulling back in order to find her place in the world. So when Dalinar takes responsibility for his actions, this is what allows him to encounter the more moderate behavior of not giving in to, like, making more rules for himself and saying, no, I must be more restrained, or just throwing away the rules altogether and saying, like, yes, I will be the nine-shadowed champion of odium and destroy all of his enemies. Those are two extreme reactions. Instead, he says, I will not let go of my pain. My pain belongs to me. I take responsibility for it. And every time that I fall, I will stand up and try to do better. I will live in this present moment. I will progress step by step. That is a very moderate approach to progress that is fully in line with the Aristotle's virtue ethics, and I think reveals to us kind of retroactively, like if we look backwards through all of the other Cosmere stories, we can see that when characters are being good, they are being moderate in this way. And so just like Kaladin, Shallan also gets thrown into the cognitive realm she has this breach with her coping mechanism, and it forces her into this, state of being literally in the mind of the world. She is now in this bizarre zone where part of her powers always lie in this place. She's more in contact with Shadesmar, I think, than Kaladin is. And it's appropriate for her at this point in the story to become the leader of the group for that reason. And what we see from her by the end of the story, when they manage to, move through the perpendicularity and join the battle against the Voidbringers and Odium's army, is that Shallan puts out all of these different versions of herself and her friends and family into the battle, to distract the enemy, but also to fight with them to a certain degree. And those versions of her avoid the extremities of, they're not grotesque or alien versions of Shallan. They're not totally divorced personas that have nothing to do with her. Instead, they're plausible versions of who she is or who she could be. And therefore, they're like in contact with the truth. And so she comes back into a more moderate zone after exploring the extremes of her experience and perception of her spiritual path. So the place that she lands is, I think, progress. It's more in touch with the truth than where she began, although it's very troubled and seeded with this link to an addictive coping mechanism of retreating into art and retreating into creating things that are actually getting in her way and are not necessarily tools for helping herself. And the only hope that she has of redeeming that kind of addiction is if she can keep it in contact with the truth. Otherwise, it's going to explode in her face the way that Vale did when they went to Colonial. So that is the three protagonists of this story. That is a lot of talking off the top of my head, but I hope you can see the way in which the Everstorm and the bringing back of the past is a thing that all three characters are dealing with personally, but is kind of like explored in a macro way through the whole book, like mechanically built into the setting itself going forward. And that reckoning with the past is something that all of the characters are coping with in different ways and kind of exploring that golden mean of, what is good and what is bad in this epic fantasy, but utterly changing what I think epic fantasy is in the Cosmere, but maybe, culturally as well. The effect that this book could have long term on the epic fantasy genre, because we encounter, a kind of allegorical dialectic by the end of the book, I think, where, as an American, I can see a way in which this story is about colonizing North America with Europeans and the indigenous people having to cope with the presence of the Europeans, the duplicity of creating treaties and moving back on them, and the genocide and deliberate infecting with disease of those communities, and all of the past responsibility of that, not to mention, the slavery of bringing people from the African continent to North America and then enslaving their ancestors merely because of the prejudice of people who blamed it on the color of their skin. The cultural weight of all of that as we try to enter into this project of creating a better society, that utopia is a fundamental idea of the American project to some degree, or that this religious idea of a kind of city on a hill that America was to the pilgrims who came over as well. that it would be a beacon, built on the rules of the Bible and an example to the rest of the countries in the world about justice and fairness and goodness. But it has all of these things, these dirty, terrible, monstrous secrets built into its core. How do we reckon with that? Where is the appropriate use of forgiveness and redemption? How is that balance struck? Do we just forget all of the things that were done in the past? Do the ancestors of Europeans have a responsibility to just pack it up and go home, if you will? Is that even possible? Or has everything so fundamentally changed to the point where the only option is to live in the present and have some kind of communal goal that arcs towards justice in acknowledging the past, but recognizes the way in which redemption might not be fully possible at this point. And instead, the only thing that can be done is to build something new that every step along the way tries to be as good as possible. I think that allegory is right there. I mean, it's like right there. It's like looking you in the face when you read this book if you're a North American. And that's not only America. This is the colonial story all over the world. It's happening in Israel, Palestine right now. It's happening, in Russia, Ukraine. It's all over the place in the world. And it has been for a lot of human history. I don't know if Sanderson is necessarily offering an answer. Certainly not in this book, he isn't. But I think he is posing a question. He is giving us the scenario and holding up the mirror to us and, inviting us to have that cognitive estrangement and perhaps make a choice and reflect on the possibilities that are available once we become unstuck from our assumptions about what is possible, when we agree to go on the journey instead of being foreclosed into the destination. So I think the book is very powerful as an artistic object, not only for the effect that it could have on the genre and on the rest of the Cosmere as a project going forward, but, politically within the lives of its readers if they become available to that project. So that is enough of me talking. I will be moving on to, I believe, the rest of the White Sand Story volumes 2 and 3, which I will break up into different episodes, and we'll finish out the story of Kenton and Chris and continue on this journey through the summer of Cosmere.